Hello guys, welcome back to the channel Basketball Fan, and today we've really got something to dig into because this wasn't just another casual preseason run, it felt bigger than that, whether people want to admit it or not. The Indiana Fever walked into New York and walked out with a 109-99 win over the Liberty, and yeah, I already know what people are going to say. It's just preseason, don't overreact, it doesn't count, we've heard all of that before. And to a certain extent, sure, that's fair, but at the same time, if you actually watched this game from start to finish, you know there were real takeaways here, real patterns, real identity flashes that you can't just ignore, and that's where things get interesting because for stretches of this game, Indiana didn't just look competitive, they looked dangerous, like a team that knows exactly how it wants to play and can actually execute it at a high level when everything clicks. Coming into this matchup, there was a lot of hesitation surrounding how Indiana would handle New York's size and length because, let's be honest, that Liberty roster is built like a defensive nightmare, long arms everywhere, bodies in every passing lane. Shot contests coming from angles you don't even expect. It's like trying to score in a forest where every tree can move, and historically, that kind of length has given Indiana problems, so naturally, there were questions about whether they'd be able to generate clean looks, whether they'd get swallowed up in the half court, whether the pace would get dragged down into something uncomfortable. But right from the opening minutes, Indiana basically said none of that matters because they came out aggressive, pushing tempo, moving the ball quickly, spacing the floor properly, and for a brief stretch, it genuinely felt like they were about to run New York out of their own building, and that's not exaggeration, that's exactly how it looked. Live because everything was flowing, everything had rhythm, and most importantly, everything had confidence. And that confidence starts with identity, because when this Fever team is playing fast, when they're running and gunning, when they're not overthinking possessions and instead just reacting, that's when they look like a completely different team. That's when the offense opens up. That's when shooters get clean looks. That's when defenses start scrambling instead of dictating, and at the center of all of that is Caitlin Clark, pushing pace, creating chaos, pulling defenders out beyond the arc, making quick reads, finding open teammates, and forcing defenses to constantly adjust on the fly. And that version of Indiana is exciting because it's unpredictable, it's difficult to guard, and it plays to their strengths instead of exposing their weaknesses. But then, and this is where the frustration starts creeping in, it happens again. The same pattern we've seen before. The momentum builds, the pace is working, everything is flowing, and then suddenly, the brakes get hit, the game slows down. The offense shifts into half-court sets, the movement decreases, the rhythm disappears, and just like that, the opposing team starts creeping back into the game, and you're sitting there watching it unfold thinking, why take away the one thing that's clearly giving you the advantage? Why shift away from the identity that's working? Because every single time Indiana slows things down against a team with size, it plays directly into the opponent's hands. It allows them to set up defensively. It allows their length to become a factor again. It reduces the space, it reduces the chaos, and suddenly, what looked like a comfortable lead starts to feel a lot more fragile. Now, to be fair, context absolutely matters here because this is preseason, rotations are not finalized, minutes are uneven, players are being tested in different roles, and yes, the coaching staff kept Indiana's starters on the floor longer than New York did, which definitely impacts how the game looks statistically and visually, because once the Liberty starters began rotating out, the dynamic naturally shifted. But even with that taken into account, the early minutes of this game, when it was closer to starter versus starter, Indiana looked sharp, they looked prepared, and they looked like a team that understands what it needs to do to be successful, and that's important because it shows that the blueprint is there. It's not theoretical. It's not something you have to imagine. It's already visible on the court when they commit to it. That said, there's still a very real issue that can't be ignored, and that's size, because the Liberty's length absolutely showed up in this game, especially in the paint, contesting shots, altering attempts, making drives more difficult, and exposing Indiana's lack of a true interior presence, particularly with key players unavailable, because without that physical anchor inside, everything becomes a little bit harder defensively and on the boards. And while you can try to compensate with speed and shooting, there are going to be moments where size simply matters, where you need that presence to stabilize things, and right now, that's an area where Indiana is still vulnerable, and it's something they're going to have to address either through adjustments or through personnel when everyone is available. At the same time, it's worth noting that New York wasn't at full strength either, so it's not like this was a completely one-sided situation in terms of availability, which makes the evaluation a bit more balanced, but even within that balance, the structural issue remains clear. When Indiana faces teams with elite size, they cannot afford to slow the game down. They have to lean into their strengths. They have to play fast, move the ball, and make quick decisions, because that's what neutralizes the size disadvantage, that's what creates openings, and that's what allows them to stay competitive in those matchups. And this is where the frustration really comes from, because you can see what this team could be, you can see the identity forming, you can see the path forward, and every time they drift away from it, the drop-off is immediate, noticeable, and avoidable, which makes it harder to accept when it keeps happening. Now, shifting focus to the moment that really got people talking, we have to address the Caitlin Clark situation, because while her performance on the court is always going to draw attention, this time it wasn't just about what she did during the game. It was about what people noticed afterward, specifically the situation with her lower back, because late in the game, she's on the bench wearing a warm-up jacket, and underneath it, there's something visible around her lower back area, and immediately, questions start popping up. Is it a back brace? Is it a heating pad? Is it just precautionary? Or is it something more serious? And if you've ever dealt with back issues, whether it's tightness, spasms, or anything along those lines, you probably recognized it right away because it looked very similar to a back brace in terms of how it sits and how it wraps, and while it could absolutely be something minor, something preventative, something that doesn't impact her long-term availability, the reality is that when it's your franchise player, people are going to pay attention, people are going to speculate, and people are going to want answers. And the reason this becomes a bigger conversation than it might otherwise be is because there's already a level of skepticism when it comes to transparency, because last season, there were multiple situations where updates were vague, where injuries were described as day-to-day without much clarity, and where fans felt like they weren't getting the full picture. So when something like this shows up on camera, it's not something that can just be brushed off or ignored, because the context surrounding it makes it more significant, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's a serious issue. But it does mean that people are going to keep asking questions until there's some kind of clarity. And ultimately, that's where things stand right now. Indiana showed flashes of exactly what they can be, a fast-paced, high-scoring, perimeter-oriented team that can overwhelm opponents when everything is clicking. But they also showed the same habits that have held them back, particularly the tendency to slow the game down at the wrong times, and until that gets resolved, until they fully commit to their identity for an entire game instead of just stretches, there's always going to be that sense of untapped potential, that feeling that they're leaving something on the table, and at the same time, there are still questions surrounding health, depth, and how they'll handle teams with elite size over the course of a full season. So while this preseason win doesn't officially count in the standings, it absolutely counts in terms of what it revealed, and if you're paying attention, you can already see the storylines starting to take shape for what could be a very interesting season ahead for the Indiana Fever, and that's exactly why games like this matter, because they give you a glimpse, not the full picture, not the final version, but a glimpse of what's coming, and right now, that glimpse is equal parts exciting and frustrating, which honestly might be the most accurate way to describe where this team stands at this point in time. So now when something like this pops up, people aren't just going to sit back and blindly accept whatever explanation comes out, and that shift in how fans react, it's important. It really is, because it shows a growing awareness around the team, around player health, and around how information is communicated. And honestly, that skepticism is fair, especially when you consider everything that's happened in the past with vague injury updates and situations that didn't always feel fully transparent. So when you see something like that lower back situation with Caitlin Clark, it naturally raises eyebrows, it naturally sparks conversation, and it naturally leads to more questions than answers. And while that doesn't mean it's time to panic, Not even close. It does mean that people are going to pay attention in a way they might not have before. It means every movement, every substitution, every visible sign is going to be analyzed a little more closely because back issues aren't something you can just ignore or assume will resolve overnight. They can linger, they can flare up unexpectedly, and they can impact performance in subtle ways that don't always show up immediately in the box score. So the right approach here isn't fear. It's awareness. It's keeping an eye on how things develop over the next few games. It's watching to see if there are any limitations in movement, any changes in minutes, any signs that the team is managing something behind the scenes, because that's what matters moving forward, not speculation, not overreaction, but observation and consistency in what we're seeing on the court. But shifting back to the game itself, because that's where the foundation of all this discussion really lies. Indiana got the win, and yes, even in preseason, that matters more than people like to admit, because confidence is a real thing in sports. Momentum is a real thing, and seeing your system actually work in a live game environment against a team like New York, that's valuable. That's something you build on, and throughout this game, you saw flashes of what this team can be when everything clicks. You saw the pace, the ball movement, the spacing, the willingness to push the tempo and attack before the defense gets set, and in those moments, Indiana didn't just look competitive. They looked like a team that could genuinely cause problems for a lot of opponents, but at the same time, you also saw the flaws, and they were just as clear as the positives, the inconsistency that creeps in when the pace slows down, the size disadvantage that becomes more noticeable in half-court situations, the difficulty of generating clean looks when the defense is fully set and able to use its length effectively, and perhaps most frustrating of all, the moments where the coaching approach seems to clash with what the roster naturally does best. Because every time the game shifts away from that fast, free-flowing style, the drop-off is immediate, it's visible, and it changes the entire feel of the game. And that's why this particular matchup was so valuable to watch, because it didn't just show highlights or isolated moments, it showed the full picture, the highs and the lows, the potential and the limitations, all in one continuous stretch. And now because of that, the questions moving forward are much clearer than they were before. And those questions are the ones that are going to define how this season unfolds for Indiana. Can this team fully commit to a fast-paced identity, not just in short bursts, but over the course of an entire game, over the course of a full season? Because that's the style that maximizes their strengths. That's the style that puts pressure on opposing defenses. And that's the style that allows players like Caitlin Clark to truly dictate the flow of the game. Or will they continue to fall into these patterns where the pace slows, the offense becomes more predictable, and the advantage they created for themselves starts to fade? Because if that pattern continues, it's going to limit how far this team can go regardless of how much talent they have on the roster, and that's a reality they're going to have to confront sooner rather than later. The next question is just as important, maybe even more so depending on how you look at it, and that's whether they can consistently compete against teams with significant size and length, because this isn't a one-off issue. This is something that's going to come up repeatedly throughout the season, and while speed and shooting can absolutely offset size to a certain extent, there are going to be moments where physicality matters, where rebounding matters, where interior defense matters. And if Indiana doesn't find ways to address those areas, whether through rotations, strategy, or personnel adjustments, it's going to remain a vulnerability that other teams will continue to exploit. And again, that's not something that gets fixed overnight, but it is something that needs to be acknowledged and worked on consistently if they want to take that next step as a team. And then, of course, there's the question that's going to be hovering over everything else. The one that ties directly into both performance and long-term outlook, and that's whether Caitlin Clark is fully okay, because as much as basketball is a team sport, there's no denying the impact she has on everything this team does, from pace to playmaking to overall confidence on the court. And if there's any kind of lingering issue, even something minor, it's going to be something people watch closely, not out of panic, but out of understanding how important she is to the team's success, and how even small limitations can have a ripple effect on how the team functions as a whole. So again, it's not about jumping to conclusions, it's about staying aware, watching how things unfold. and seeing if there's any indication that this is more than just a precautionary measure. And as we wrap all of this up here on Basketball Fan, it really comes down to perspective, because you can look at this game and see a preseason win that doesn't count in the standings, or you can look at it and see a preview of what this team might be capable of. Both the good and the bad, and honestly, the truth is somewhere in the middle, because this game gave us something real to analyze, something tangible to build expectations around, and something that highlights both the excitement and the uncertainty surrounding this Indiana Fever team as they move forward. And that's why it matters. That's why it's worth talking about. And that's why it's worth paying attention to what comes next. Because the next few games are going to tell us a lot about whether these patterns continue, whether adjustments are made, and whether this team can start turning those flashes of potential into something more consistent and sustainable. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for today here on Basketball Fan, but I definitely want to hear from you, because this is one of those games where different people can take away different things depending on what they focus on. So let me know down in the comments what stood out to you the most. Did you see the same strengths and weaknesses? Are you concerned at all about the back situation? Or do you think it's being overblown? And most importantly, do you believe this team should fully commit to that run-and-gun style moving forward? Because if there's one thing this game made clear, it's that when they play that way, they're at their most dangerous, and figuring out whether they can sustain it might be the key to their entire season. So as always, appreciate you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more breakdowns just like this, and I'll catch you in the next one, where we'll see if the Fever can keep this momentum going or if some of these same questions start popping up again, because one thing's for sure, this team is not going to be boring to watch, and that alone makes this season worth following closely, especially if games keep delivering moments like the ones we saw here, with big shots falling, defenses scrambling, players stepping up, and that feeling that something is building, even if it's not fully there yet. And that's the kind of energy you want heading into a new season, because it means there's something to prove, something to chase, and something to believe in, even if it's still a work in progress.